President of OFSF, Ms. Binaifer Nowrojee.
Thank you for the warm welcome. Prof, thank you. It's wonderful to be here tonight. And I feel the warmth and I feel the hospitality. So thank you, all of you who've taken the time to come. I also want to say thanks to Hope for saying in fewer words than I'm going to use the same messaging and the power of poetry to really briefly and succinctly catch a moment. So thank you. So we meet in a moment where many are raising questions about the future of human rights, against a backdrop of an escalation in violations, widening impunity. And many are forced to ask, are the approaches to human rights that we've worked on still adequate, still effective? What is the role of human rights in a shifting global order? What must we defend? What must we reimagine? And how do we ensure that human rights remains an effective tool for justice? So these are some of the questions I'm going to tackle today. And to share thoughts about how we move forward, what we need to think about and debate, and where are some of the new ideas and solutions that we're going to find. Let's start by going back a bit. So when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted 8 decades ago, there was a disagreement about the very first sentence. So US First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was leading the process, proposed that Article 1 should say, quote, "All men are born free and equal in dignity and rights." In principle, that was meant as a statement of equality, but it excluded more people than it actually included. All human beings, she insisted, are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This simple yet profound change affirmed the universality of human rights. It transcends gender, race, class, other distinctions, and it stood the test of time, inclusive of all people, of all identities. And it affirms the essential idea of the universal nature of human rights. Whoever we are, wherever we are the same people, and we have the same rights. Thank you, Mansa Mehta. Mehta's vision reminds us that human rights are not just a Western construct, or a mark of superiority, or some foreign creed imposed on us by the powerful. Mehta was a key part of the struggles of her moment. She founded and led the National Women's Workers Group, which organized non-violent, all-women protests against colonial rule in India. And for her campaigning, she was arrested and imprisoned 3 times. As the president of the All India Women's Conference, Mehta drafted the Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties that affirmed human equality, rejected discrimination, and giving civil and political rights on the one hand and economic and social rights on the other with the same importance. She saw that civic rights, the right to education and health, and the right to divorce were all interlinked and interdependent for women. Following the Universal Declaration, she worked on the Indian Constitution, and she enshrined the same rights and freedoms, but also went beyond them. And Mehta wasn't alone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was shaped by voices across the global south. Shaista Poonawalla, a Pakistani novelist and diplomat, insisted on the prohibition against child and forced marriage. In the drafting committee was a Lebanese philosopher and diplomat, Charles Malik. And when the declaration was ratified, 34 of the 48 signatory nations were from the global south. The number could not be larger at that time because so many other nations were yet to win their freedom from colonialism. Quote, "We know that as women we have many problems which hold us back from taking part fully in the struggle. And it is precisely for that purpose that we have come to break down these problems," Mtwana said. "Let us come out as a unifying force. Let us take our place in the freedom struggle." For that, the apartheid authorities targeted her work. At the Germiston March, which was part of the Defiance Campaign of 1952, The police detained her and 29 other South African women, and she was sentenced to 14 days in Boksburg prison. Like Meta, Mtwana was one of the drafters of a landmark human rights document, the Freedom Charter. The process that led to the drafting of the Freedom Charter is a vivid demonstration of how human rights are not a gift that's bestowed from above, but are always born out of struggles from below, from acts of defiance, and from an unyielding belief in our shared humanity. Mtwana and other activists in the ANC sent out 50,000 volunteers into the townships and countryside to collect freedom demands from the people of South Africa. And when they were all laid out together in a tapestry of hope, they were a set of rights that are essential for people to realize their freedom and dignity everywhere. Where the people govern themselves, where all national groups have equal rights, where all people share in the country's wealth, where all are equal under the law and all have human rights, and where there is work, security, learning, culture, housing, peace, and friendship. These aspirations are universal. We find them across time and place, assuming different forms and emerging out of different struggles. Whether it was the overthrow of slavery after a long and determined resistance in places like Haiti, Jamaica, Brazil, that included revolts, escapes, and everyday acts of defiance. Or the fight for women's rights in Seneca Falls, to the British suffragettes, to Meta in India, and Mtwana in South Africa. The movements for national liberation and independence, the movements for LGBTQ rights, labor movements, disability rights movement, indigenous rights movements, the anti-apartheid movement, all of these movements were animated by a refusal to accept injustice and exclusion, sweeping aside the barriers that were designed to hold them back. They all imagined a future that recognized the full humanity of all of us as people equal in rights and dignity. So let's look at today. Where are we? It is this idea that is under threat in this moment. The universality of human rights are under attack from forces that want to fragment rights, divide rights, create exclusions to them. Instead of a world where all people enjoy all rights all of the time, there are some in this world seeking to create a world of some rights for some people, only some of the time. Europe was the place where refugee rights first emerged in the wake of the horrors of the Holocaust. The Refugee Convention of 1951 was the response to cruelty of governments that turned survivors away from their borders. The convention promised sanctuary to people fleeing persecution because of race, religion, nationality, or their political views. The right to political asylum is now being eviscerated on the same continent where it was codified. Asylum seekers and refugees in Europe only represent a small fraction of the people who flee persecution, war, and other tragedies. The overwhelming majority of refugees are being hosted by their neighbors, neighboring countries, but one after another, as politics lurches further and further to the right, European governments are now demonizing people who are seeking sanctuary, calling them criminals or invaders. They've closed their doors. They've paid off countries to act as border guards in their regions or a destination for deportation. And they've divided human beings, escaping desperate situations, pitting refugees against each other, saying they'll welcome some from some countries, but not others. In the same way, we're seeing rights being pitted against each other. We've seen how far-right movements, conservative religious groups, and populist leaders are repackaging the human rights discourse to justify exclusionary politics. Women's rights and the rights of LGBTQ people are coming under assault from people who say that these are inconsistent with the right, for instance, to religious freedom. The right to free speech is being suppressed on the pretext of the right to security. And we're seeing some people being excluded by rights altogether. In Afghanistan, the cruel misogyny of the Taliban regime has sought to render Afghan women and girls completely invisible, snatching away from them their rights to work, education, speech, and freedom of movement. And in situations of conflict, in the DRC, in Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, elsewhere, we see a deadly disregard for human life and an indifference, with the world just standing by and watching, as if somehow mass killings are just an inevitability, and that only some lives are worthy of being grieved, and that civilian protections can only apply for some situations. The Universal Declaration was placed at the heart of the liberal international order that took shape after the Second World War. The powerful states that presided over the creation of the United Nations and other institutions were entrusted with the promotion and protection of human rights. What we see today, however, is those same states dismantling the international order, trampling over its norms, discarding its rules, assaulting the institutions that were created to hold abusive governments accountable, and creating a climate of impunity. On the UN Security Council, the permanent members are now only divided between states that once championed human rights, but have now seen their moral authority depleted over recent years, and states that never claimed to champion them in the first place. We see it also in the European Union. At the same time, we see other states, and maybe more states, and most of them from the global south, beginning to take their place at the table to reaffirm their respect for international law and human rights. Take the votes in the UN General Assembly, where clear majorities have condemned violations of human rights and international law being committed in Sudan, Ukraine, and the Middle East. At the International Court of Justice, to cite one example, more than 100 states are currently involved in the human rights-related cases, including South Africa's notable intervention on Israel-Palestine. These countries are shifting human rights and the international law framework, even as it's been forced to grapple with new challenges. A record 97 states, half of the world, are taking part in the advisory proceedings on the international legal and human rights obligations that states have towards climate and towards those states that are being devastated particularly by climate change. These efforts by a wider range of states working across continents, creating new forms of solidarity, are going to be crucial players for the protection of human rights in the future and the preservation of international law. These are the new champions for human rights. These are the people that are going to bring us a new moral imagination, because the world we have known is vanishing, but the new one is yet to appear. And in this moment, people with a shared sense of our common humanity are going to have the opportunity to shape what comes next, to ensure that human rights are at the heart of the new world that the next generation is going to live in. To be able to do this, to place human rights at the heart of what comes next, means reckoning with how human rights work is done today and the framework that's used. From its beginnings in the 1960s, the human rights movement has made tremendous strides. It's documented and exposed violations, it's introduced new norms and laws, it's held governments accountable. It transformed the relationship between the state and the individual. Under colonial rule and other forms of authoritarian rule, it was only the state who had rights. People had duties towards the state. So the powerful breakthrough that the human rights movement has made was to invert that relationship, to say that the state has obligations to its citizens and that people have rights. The attacks we see on human rights today seek to reverse this dynamic, with states discarding their obligations and snatching away rights. The fight against the anti-rights forces needs to be smart, needs to be robust, it needs to be targeted. We need a human rights movement, and we need a framework that's up to the challenge of this moment. And in many places, we have to acknowledge that civil society has drifted away from the communities that it seeks to represent and serve. But the demand for rights has not gone away. To the contrary, we see more determined efforts to assert rights. There's an upsurge in rights violations, for example, even on the African continent. Attacks on rights of women and girls, femicide, detention without trial, abductions by state and parastatal groups, reported cases of torture, harassment of journalists, judges, lawyers, human rights defenders. But there is also an upsurge in the assertiveness of young people and women to affirm and fight for their rights, resisting repressive governments, organizing in new ways, and imagining new rights. So across the world, social movements, activists, ordinary citizens, young and old, continue to push back against authoritarian overreach and mobilize for justice. From the streets of Nairobi and Seoul to the streets of Dakar and Dhaka, the fight for human rights is alive and determined. As the history of this country, of the anti-apartheid struggle has shown, wherever there is repression, you'll find resistance. And that resistance and these new movements are where we need to be. These are the people we must seek to out. These are the people we must stand with. And these are the people who we will imagine a future together with. The human rights framework as it exists is an impressive collection of rules, norms, standards. It took basic human aspirations for justice and dignity and made them universally recognized as rights. The violations of these rights went from being domestic issues of national sovereignty to matters of international concern with a binding legal framework. And we see the persistent power of human rights litigation, whether it's the South African government going to the ICJ or US lawyers that are stepping up to challenge the new administration's slew of executive orders in the United States. In Kenya, the Law Society and human rights actors are engaged in demanding justice for those who've been abducted during and after last year's Gen Z protests. In Uganda, South Korea, Senegal, superior and constitutional courts have successfully blocked executive overreach. We also have challenges. We also have weaknesses. We lack enforcement mechanisms often, with states able to successfully resist pressure. And we'll now see the Filipino president has just been called up now, the former. There's an ambivalence about some rights as well. We don't want to privilege civil and political rights as absolute and ignore economic rights of basic rights to education, housing, food, and subsistence. We also want to see inequality tackled. It's one of our biggest issues at the moment. Our world only seeks to put a floor under how low the poor can sink, but never a ceiling on how high the rich can rise. And it's fewer and fewer and fewer that are going up. This world and this framework has long depended on the power and influence of Western states, counting on them to always be the promoters globally of human rights. A proposition that is now untenable, where the moral authority of those states are waning and the redistribution of power in the world is diminishing their influence. We also haven't imagined the rights of the future, a world of complexity and uncertainty. And we know human rights will be challenged because we're facing an intersecting systemic crisis of all sorts of global challenges that will need to be unlocked as a group in order for us to actually move into the future. So what is it that we should be doing? Let me end with 6 crucial shifts that I think we must make to ensure that human rights remain at the heart of our new emerging world, to be a force for radical transformation and not left behind as a hollow-out ideal on paper in some dusty shelf. First, we must ensure that our approach is one that's guided by the demands of the communities who are affected. This is how, after all, universal human rights emerged, as the work of Hansa Mehta and Ida Mtwana showed us. Too often, the human rights movement is criticized for being too elitist, for being too disconnected from the realities of the people it seeks to serve. So we must invest in grassroots movement, in communities, in individuals, people right at the front line of the fights for human rights. We have to amplify the voices that exist at the margins of traditional civil society and ensure that our strategies are rooted in people's experiences at the front lines. Second, we need to modernize our methods and make them more relevant. Move beyond just the legal and technical ways of seeing human rights, distant from rights holders or standardized reports, conferences, performative tweets. We really need to move to drive real, tangible change. Is the human rights movement in its current form truly capable of disrupting and shifting power, or is it part of the machinery that sustains the status quo? We need to ask ourselves that. Third, given that we are facing an interlocking systemic crisis globally, we need to have an intersectional analysis and approach of how we undo it. It's one that connects race, gender, indigenous groups, class struggles, and we're seeing this. This is how the younger movements are actually connecting. They're no longer in silos. They're actually reaching out to each other, and they're reaching out across regions. People at the front lines, they don't see these struggles as separate and distinct in the way that the human rights movement often has. Nor do they see human rights as limited to those of just individual rights. So this is a moment where we need to be listening to make these rights relevant to the complexities of people's struggles for justice and dignity. Fourth, the future of human rights depends on advocating not only for those who are here now, but also for generations to come. And this is the imagination that led people who set up the United Nations. They were thinking of generations to come. We're now at a crossroads. We must also do the same. Our human rights discourse must extend beyond the immediate. It must confront the existential threats shaping the world we are going to leave behind. The degradation of the environment, the accelerating impacts of climate change, the risks of nuclear conflict, and the unchecked rise of artificial intelligence all demand a more forceful and forward-looking response. Fifth, linked to this, we must also acknowledge that the future will largely be in the digitized realm, almost unrecognizable from the world that existed at the time of the Universal Declaration. Just as we've escalated global efforts around climate change and environmental justice, we must now do the same for digital rights and protections. Technology has and is rapidly reshaping societies, and yet our human rights frameworks are struggling to keep pace. Mass surveillance, algorithmic bias, digital censorship, and the monopolization of online spaces by powerful entities are threatening freedoms, deepening inequalities, and silencing dissent. Digital justice must be a core pillar of human rights advocacy. Stronger privacy protections, equitable internet access, transparent artificial intelligence governance, these are all going to be critical to secure human rights in the digital age, including for children who will be entering this era and world of digital vulnerability from day one. And lastly, we must invest in movement building and transnational solidarity as a way to resist the global anti-rights agendas. No country, no activist, no organization can fight these battles alone. We need global South alliances that are relevant to the new world we are entering. We need to develop new ways of organizing, new institutions, new strategies to meet our demands and the challenges of our time and beyond. We know there's no straight line to human rights work. We know there's no clear, smooth, or predictable paths of progress. We know it's never linear. There's often obstacles, setbacks, distractions, defeats. And the work of human rights will never be complete. Even when success is achieved and it feels secure, we see how quickly it can be reversed. So this is not a moment to back down or retreat or fall into despair. It is the time to renew our commitment to human rights and make them relevant and update them for the moment we find ourselves in. As Ida Mtwana urged us, let us unite, let us go forward with courage and determination. Thank you.